This is a detail of the Sony RX10 Mark IV. This is the view from the back, and if you're used to Sony cameras, you'll notice that it has a very similar design. Now, it's not quite as sophisticated as the A9 or the A7R Mark III. You'll see that it doesn't have a joystick like they do, but I still find that this is a very, very nice camera to use, especially since they've added phase detect autofocus. That made the difference for me from any previous RX10 Mark 1, 2, or 3. They were all contrast-based autofocus, and while they worked okay, I didn't really like them, especially for sports, even though it had the reach. This one has phase detect autofocus, and it is great. So my friend Chuck asks, says, I love the camera, but I haven't figured out the focus. Is there an online instruction you recommend? Well, hopefully this one will be one. I've gone over a few, but they don't clearly show, i.e. focus on the focus option. So in this video now, I want to kind of go over with Chuck what I do to set up the camera. Now, focus options for me start with the way that you configure the camera. And the way I prefer to do the camera is to use back button focus. And I use the AEL button as my way to activate autofocus. And I also don't put on autofocus on the shutter. So how I do that is I go to Menu, Camera 2, and Menu 9. Oops. And I go to Custom Keys, hit that button in the center, hit the right arrow, and then go to the AEL button. As you can see, it's AF on. Now, the default is auto exposure lock. That's what it's written there. And that's okay, but I prefer to have autofocus on, use that back button to start and stop focus. I don't use auto exposure, so for me, auto exposure lock is not that big of a deal. And I separate the focus from that shutter button. So I turn off the shutter by going to Menu, Camera 1, Menu 5, and then it says AF with shutter. I turn that off. So the default is that is on. Now, I also set up this side button, which you can't really see very well, but it's a bigger button. You'll see it on other lenses like the 24-70 G Master, the 70-200 2.8. They have this focus hold button on there. The default is focus hold, but I changed that. I changed that to be my eye autofocus since I don't have a second button or a switch like the A7R Mark II had, which allowed me to keep everything in the back. So I have to put my eye autofocus here on this side button, which is dedicated to focus hold. So in order to do that, I go to Menu, Menu button, Camera 2, Menu 9, and you see that number right up there, and I go to Custom Key Shooting just like I did with the first one, and I go to Menu 2, and the focus hold button is eye autofocus. Now focus hold is the default, but I change it to this, eye autofocus. So that way I have a way to use engage eye autofocus right away. That's a big deal for me. So this gets you set up to shoot in virtually any mode in terms of your focus modes or your metering modes. But this is the way I like to configure the camera. If you don't like to use back button focus, that's quite all right. Some people don't like to do it and they just want to use the default, but I would use, you still want to separate focus and fire, and you can do that with this way. It's just, for me, after using back button focus for so many years, I just find it so much easier to work this way. And I recommend that you set the AEL button to your eye autofocus if you use your shutter to activate your autofocus. All right, so that's the focus settings. The camera settings, this is kind of my baseline. For the cameras, I almost always use manual mode, which is the M mode up top, and I set my ISO manually. Now, in most of the Sony cameras, the ISO is painted over here, but it's not on this camera. So I typically set that and I keep it for my ISO, I manually input my ISO because I like to see it in real time. That's one of the really neat advantages of using an EVF is that you see as you shoot what you're getting exposure wise, as long as you're not shooting strobe. But if you're shooting continuous lights or if you're shooting available light, you will see the light as it is in real time, and that's huge. I typically set my autofocus to autofocus continuous. That way, as long as I am pushing that AEL button, that rear button, my autofocus is moving. It is engaging. And when I take my thumb off, so I just go like that and then take it off, and I'm doing this constantly, and you'll get used to it after a while. I drop my thumb and it stops focus. So what that does in essence is combines the best of AFS, autofocus single, with autofocus continuous, and you're able to go and just instantly get your photos. And if people start moving and you need to track them, you're already in autofocus continuous mode. It's, to me, the best way to work. It's the best of both worlds. So for virtually everything I use these days, I use wide area focus. Now, wide area focus is this setting on the camera. I love it because it takes advantage of almost the entire frame, depending on the camera, in terms of what it's going to give you for focus. That is very cool. I also will try this one. Center focus is okay. It reminds me of the old way that I shot with the Canon 5D Mark II, which had the best predictive autofocus sensor in the center. You can also do a movable one, flexible spot, and you can move it this way. But the thing is it doesn't work as well with this camera because it doesn't have a joystick. It works better with the A7R Mark III and the A9. And then I'll go down here. Lock on, expand, flexible spot is something that I've used with the 6300, not so much with this camera, because I find its autofocus is so darn good. The A9, the A7R Mark III, is I just pretty much use it on wide area autofocus and then just reframe where I need my focus points to be. So it's kind of a little bit of practice. I've also discovered that the camera tends to default to focus to the center, and it works really well. The other part of making this camera work really well for you in autofocus is your custom buttons. And I set my custom button 1 for smile face detection. So I'll show you that. And I typically leave it off, but I like to have it there right by my index finger so that I can quickly change it to face detection. Because if I'm in a portrait session, I want to use face detection. I also want to use eye autofocus as well, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that. But I want to use face detection, but if I get into a situation where there's a lot of people there, well, that could be really problematic. So I will have it there in C1 so I can get to it right away. In C2, I put it into audio signals. And with this camera, I typically use it in silent mode. It is so good. I don't notice any kind of real jelloing or rolling shutter issues. And maybe that's because it's a smaller camera size sensor. I'm not sure, but it's been really good, even shooting sports. And my friend Chuck asked, is there a reason not to shoot silence? Well, there's times you may not want to shoot silent because you might be photographing a model, somebody who's used to having the audio feedback of a camera, who wants to hear that shutter, even if it's an electronic manufactured shutter, make some kind of noise so that they know that, yes, this is when you're firing, this is when you're firing. But when I'm out and about and I'm photographing people and I want to be as inconspicuous as possible, and if you're firing at 24 frames a second and you're making a noise with your shutter, people might hear it, especially if they're close by. But if you're in silent mode, of course, they're not. So I just keep it in silent mode, and it's again in C2 so that if I need to change it quickly, I can make that happen. And then finally, Chuck's question that he asked was, well, how do I make it not shoot the highest frame rate? Because then there's a lot of photos that I have to edit. And I totally agree. There's a couple ways you can get to that. And firstly, in the default function menu, you go to the upper left corner. And the default for that is your speed, your drive mode. Now it's in mid. If you move the arrows to the left and the right, you're going to get low, high, medium, mid, and then you can do single by pushing up by the display button, going back down on the bottom part of it. Then you can get your self-timer modes, 2, 5, and 10 seconds, and then you can do your bracketing. Self-timer continuous, 10 seconds, 3 images. You can, oh, I'm sorry, that was your continuous, not your bracketing. This is your bracketing, where you can do 3 images with plus or minus a third of a stop, and you can also adjust that as well. So I tend to just use it in regular self-timer mode, and when I'm shooting sports, I'm in high speed. When I'm doing regular things around town or just making photos, I'm in low. I don't usually use it in single, but sometimes I do. But that's typically when I want to be really locked on, and maybe I'm doing some details or some kind of a setup. But that's basically it. That's how I configure my camera. Now, my other Sony cameras are not exactly the same, but the same principles apply. And I'll do a setup video on my A7R Mark III setup settings, because I think that might be helpful too as well. So please, if you would, subscribe to this channel and leave any comments below. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. I hope you found this helpful, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.